and the Prime Minister sent a letter to all members of Parliament explaining it. This judgment is the unanimous judgment of all 11 justices. The first question is whether the lawfulness of the Prime Minister's advice to Her Majesty is justiciable. The courts have exercised a supervisory jurisdiction over the lawfulness of acts of the government for centuries.
The Supreme Court has just delivered a shocking verdict that no one in Britain saw coming, and it has struck right at the heart of power, leaving Prime Minister Kier Starmer fighting for his political life. In one historic ruling, the highest court in the land has exposed a massive financial scandal, so staggering that it threatens not only to end Starmer's career, but to rip the foundations of British democracy apart. Forget rumours, forget speculation. This is a legal judgment that carries the weight of truth, and it has pulled back the curtain on the secret world of gifts, money and political influence that Starmer worked so hard to hide. The question now is not just whether he can survive, but whether the office of Prime Minister itself can recover from this devastating blow. The story begins with the Supreme Court's unprecedented move to directly strike down Kier Starmer's financial dealings, a decision that has electrified the nation and plunged Westminster into chaos. For months, whispers had echoed through political circles about the Prime Minister's hidden wealth, questionable donors and undisclosed luxury perks. But no one imagined the scandal would escalate into a courtroom battle that would end with the most powerful office in Britain being condemned by the judiciary. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was a thunderous declaration that no leader, no matter how high, stands above the law. The ruling itself was delivered by Chief Justice Dame Sue Carr, who in a calm but devastating statement outlined how Starmer had systematically failed to declare gifts worth hundreds of thousands of pounds, ranging from Italian designer suits to private jet flights across Europe, all conveniently timed around political decisions that benefited his wealthy allies. The court's findings read like a catalogue of betrayal. Investigators uncovered that Starmer received a set of luxury watches valued at more than £70,000 just days before announcing a tax reform that eased burdens on media investors. Documents revealed private dinners with billionaire backers whose generosity seemed to align suspiciously with policy shifts. Even more damning were the records of undisclosed holidays, all expenses paid trips to exclusive resorts, conveniently hidden under the guise of business meetings. For the judiciary, these were not innocent mistakes. They were deliberate omissions carefully designed to shield the Prime Minister from public scrutiny. Dame Sue Carr made it clear that Starmer's behaviour eroded trust in the office he holds, declaring that when the leader of the nation chooses secrecy over honesty, the entire system of democracy trembles. What made the judgment even more shocking was the court's decision to go further than simply condemning Starmer's conduct. It explicitly warned that his actions had crossed the line into possible criminality, raising the prospect of prosecution. Legal experts were stunned. Never before had a sitting Prime Minister faced such a damning rebuke from the country's top court. The impact was immediate and explosive. Within hours of the ruling, Parliament was in uproar. Senior Labour MPs who once stood firmly behind Starmer began breaking ranks, voicing deep concern that the party's reputation was being shredded. Local councillors from Labour's northern heartlands, the backbone of Starmer's political rise, erupted in anger, accusing him of betrayal and dishonesty. The once solid unity of Labour began to fracture before the public's eyes. As news networks broadcast wall-to-wall coverage of the scandal, the streets outside Downing Street filled with furious protesters demanding Starmer's resignation. Placards screamed words like corrupt and resign now, and the anger in the air was palpable. For ordinary citizens who had endured years of economic hardship, the revelations were a bitter pill. How could the Prime Minister preach about transparency and fairness while secretly indulging in luxury perks funded by the wealthy elite? The scandal struck at the heart of public trust, confirming the worst suspicions that politics was rigged in favour of those with money and power. Meanwhile, legal scholars warned that Starmer's defiance, his insistence that the ruling was politically motivated, was dangerously reckless, undermining the very independence of the judiciary. The Prime Minister was not just fighting for his career, he was threatening to destabilise the constitutional balance of the nation. And as Britain watched this drama unfold, one haunting question began to echo across the country. If the Supreme Court has already exposed this much, what deeper, darker truths about Kier Starmer's financial dealings are still waiting to be revealed? The fallout from the Supreme Court's devastating ruling against Kier Starmer spread like wildfire, tearing through the political system with unstoppable force. What had started as whispers in the corridors of Westminster had now erupted into an all-out crisis that threatened to rip the Labour Party apart. In the hours after the judgment, cracks that had been quietly forming within Labour suddenly split wide open. Senior figures who once defended Starmer's integrity were now distancing themselves, some publicly, others in private meetings filled with tension and betrayal. The once loyal inner circle began to crumble, with advisers resigning one after another, refusing to stand by a leader accused of corruption at the highest level. It was not just about gifts or watches anymore. It was about the survival of a party that prided itself on fairness and accountability, now tainted by scandal. The first to abandon ship was a senior Treasury advisor who resigned within 24 hours of the verdict, a move that sent shockwaves through Downing Street. Soon after, whispers of mass resignation circulated in the media, with insiders speaking of chaos and panic behind closed doors. Cabinet ministers were said to be holding emergency calls late into the night, debating whether they could still back their leader or whether it was time to save themselves from political ruin. Meanwhile, letters demanding Starmer's resignation began to pour into the 1922 committee, each one a dagger to his already weakened leadership. Labour MPs from the north, once his strongest base of support, openly expressed feelings of betrayal. For them, the scandal was personal. Their communities had trusted Starmer, believed his promises, and now felt deceived. The sense of anger was not quite frustration, but loud, fiery outrage that echoed in town halls and community meetings across Britain. Protests grew louder, spreading from London to Manchester, Birmingham and Newcastle, where crowds filled city centres demanding accountability. The scenes were unprecedented, ordinary citizens chanting for a Prime Minister to step down, waving banners that accused him of corruption, while television cameras captured the fury of a public that had lost faith. For many Britons already struggling with inflation, rising bills, and broken promises, the scandal was not just about one man's misconduct. It was about a system that seemed rotten to the core, where leaders enjoyed luxury while the people endured hardship. Starmer, once seen as the antidote to years of political dishonesty, was now painted as the very image of betrayal. Inside Parliament, the atmosphere grew heavier by the day. When Starmer entered the Commons after the ruling, silence greeted him. No cheers, no jeers, only an eerie quiet that spoke louder than words. His own front bench chairs avoided eye contact, while opposition MPs looked on with disbelief. The weight of the scandal hung over the chamber like a suffocating fog. Behind the scenes, rival factions within Labour were already preparing for the unthinkable, a leadership challenge. Plans for a snap contest were whispered in corridors as ambitious figures quietly lined up their supporters, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The idea that a Prime Minister could be forced out by the judiciary and abandoned by his own party was once unthinkable, but now it was becoming inevitable. Starmer's response only deepened the crisis. At a tense press conference, he lashed out at the Supreme Court, calling the ruling political theatre dressed up as law, a comment that drew gasps across the nation. Legal experts warned that such attacks undermined democracy itself, with former Supreme Court Justice Lord Neuberger calling Starmer's words reckless beyond measure. The Law Society condemned him for undermining the judiciary, while constitutional scholars warned of a dangerous precedent. If the Prime Minister could openly defy the authority of the courts, what did that mean for the rule of law? Instead of calming the storm, Starmer had thrown petrol onto the flames, turning his defiance into a symbol of arrogance. The media pounced, broadcasting rolling coverage of the scandal, dissecting every new revelation. Headlines screamed of corruption, betrayal and collapse. Analysts debated not if but when Starmer would face a vote of no confidence. Some speculated that criminal charges could follow, given the damning evidence of deliberate financial deception. Others asked if Labour could even survive the scandal intact. The story was no longer confined to politics, it was now a national obsession, dominating dinner table conversations, fueling social media outrage and casting a shadow over Britain's future. And yet, beneath the noise and fury, one chilling truth lingered. The Supreme Court's ruling may have been just the beginning. What if this scandal was only the first layer, hiding even deeper secrets that could shatter the entire political establishment? The crisis surrounding Kier Starmer now reached levels that Britain had never witnessed before, transforming from a scandal into a full-blown constitutional earthquake. What began as whispers of misconduct had become a national revolt, and Labour, the party that once stood united behind him, now looked more like a battlefield than a political organisation. Inside Westminster, senior MPs no longer bothered to hide their frustrations. In hushed conversations and leaked memos, names of potential successors were circulating, each faction preparing for the day they would step forward to claim the shattered throne. What had once been unthinkable, a sitting Prime Minister facing a leadership coup triggered not by an election but by a Supreme Court ruling, was now spoken of as a matter of when, not if. The rebellion started in the shadows but quickly burst into the open. Labour councillors across northern England, the party's lifeblood, issued blistering statements condemning Starmer for betraying their trust. Some MPs even went further, standing before television cameras to demand his resignation outright, warning that every day he clung to power was another day Labour bled credibility. Inside the party, factions hardened. One camp argued that forcing Starmer out was the only way to save Labour from electoral annihilation. Another, though shrinking, clung desperately to loyalty, fearing that ousting a Prime Minister under judicial condemnation would shatter the party beyond repair. Yet the numbers told the real story. Letters to the 1922 committee piled up, signalling that a vote of no confidence was no longer a threat, but an imminent reality. The atmosphere in Parliament became electric, every session charged with anticipation of a collapse. Opposition MPs hammered Starmer with accusations while his own benches sat cold and distant. When he rose to speak, the chamber felt hollow, his words met with silence or barely concealed smirks. The authority of his office was disintegrating in real time, leaving Britain with a Prime Minister who could not command loyalty from his party, respect from the judiciary, or trust from the people. Yet, astonishingly, Starmer refused to bow. He framed himself as a victim of a political conspiracy, lashing out at what he called elites in robes and promising to fight on. But his defiance only hardened the anger of his critics and deepened the sense that Britain was spiralling toward a dangerous constitutional showdown. As Labour fractured, the legal storm gathered new momentum. Prosecutors began quietly reviewing the court's findings, raising the terrifying prospect that criminal charges could soon follow. Legal commentators on national television debated openly whether the evidence of undisclosed gifts and false declarations would be enough to bring charges of fraud or misconduct in public office. Some argued that the scale of the scandal demanded nothing less than prosecution, while others warned that dragging a Prime Minister into criminal court would plunge Britain into uncharted waters. The speculation alone was enough to keep the nation on edge as the headlines screamed of impending indictments and Starmer's legal nightmare. Meanwhile, Britain's streets grew angrier. Demonstrations swelled, no longer limited to the cities but spreading into towns and villages. Ordinary citizens marched with banners demanding not only Starmer's resignation but sweeping reforms to cleanse politics of corruption. For many, the scandal was the last straw. Years of broken promises, economic struggles and elite privilege had built up a reservoir of rage, and Starmer's downfall had simply burst the dam. The protests became a movement, with chants calling for justice echoing across the nation. Images of tens of thousands marching through the streets were broadcast worldwide, making Britain look less like a stable democracy and more like a nation teetering on the brink. In the face of this fury, the Labour Party's survival seemed doubtful. Could a party divided against itself, led by a man condemned by the Supreme Court, still hope to govern? Or was this the moment Britain would see the collapse of not just a leader, but an entire political order? And if criminal charges were truly on the horizon, could Kier Starmer soon become the first Prime Minister in British history to stand trial while still clinging to office? The storm had now reached its peak. Britain stood on the edge of a political abyss, with Kier Starmer at the centre of a scandal that had grown too big to contain. The Supreme Court's ruling had set the fire, but it was Starmer's defiance, his refusal to step aside, that had turned a crisis into a full-blown constitutional showdown. The once calm waters of British politics were now raging with fury, and the question on every lip was simple: how much longer could the Prime Minister hold on? The answer seemed closer with each passing hour, as whispers of a no-confidence vote turned into concrete plans. The 1922 committee confirmed it had received enough letters to trigger the process, setting the stage for a dramatic confrontation that could bring down the government. Britain braced for impact. Inside Westminster, the tension was unbearable. In shadowy corridors, MPs huddled in secret, weighing loyalty against survival. Cabinet ministers who had once pledged unwavering support now prepared statements of resignation, ready to abandon ship when the tide finally turned. The atmosphere was heavy with betrayal and calculation. One senior Labour MP, speaking anonymously to the press, summed up the mood. It's not a question of if Starmer falls, but how hard and how fast. In the Commons chamber, the silence that greeted Starmer each time he rose to speak was deafening. A leader without authority, a Prime Minister without trust. His presence only reminded Britain of the scandal eating away at the heart of its democracy. Beyond the walls of Parliament, the nation roared with anger. Protests swelled to unprecedented numbers, spilling into every corner of the country. From London streets to small towns in Yorkshire, voices shouted in unison, "Resign! Resign!" The anger was not abstract. It was raw, personal, driven by years of frustration and the feeling that the political class had abandoned the people. News outlets broadcast images of thousands waving banners, demanding justice, while commentators warned that the public's patience had snapped. Britain was no longer simply debating a scandal. It was demanding change, and yet amid the fury and the chaos, Starmer stood firm, refusing to step down. In an extraordinary Downing Street address, he insisted he would fight on, dismissing the no-confidence vote as political theatre designed to destabilise the government. His words were met with outrage, but also disbelief. How could a Prime Minister condemned by the Supreme Court, deserted by allies, and rejected by the public, still cling so desperately to power? Analysts warned that his defiance was not just arrogance, it was dangerous. By refusing to respect the court's judgment and the people's demand for accountability, Starmer was dragging Britain into uncharted waters, where the authority of law and the stability of democracy itself were at risk. Meanwhile, speculation about criminal charges grew louder. Legal experts openly predicted that prosecutors would soon have no choice but to act, given the scale of the evidence. If Starmer were to face formal charges while still in office, it would shatter every precedent in British history. Some whispered of a scenario too shocking to imagine: a Prime Minister escorted out of Downing Street, not by party rebels but by the law itself. The thought sent shivers through Westminster as MPs wondered if Britain's greatest political scandal was only just beginning. As the countdown to the no-confidence vote began, the air grew electric. Was this the moment Labour would finally split apart? Would Britain see its leader fall in disgrace? Or would Starmer somehow defy the odds and cling to power against all reason? The stakes could not be higher. The verdict of the Supreme Court had already shaken the nation, but the true test was yet to come. In the coming hours, Britain would learn whether its democracy still had the strength to hold its leaders accountable, or whether corruption and defiance would triumph over justice. And so the question that now hangs over Britain is the one that will define this era. Will Kier Starmer fall to the will of the people and the judgment of the law? Or will he drag the nation into a constitutional crisis from which it may never recover?